Oh, good afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Some people are still
Hello.
coming in, so let's get started slowly. Um, I want to go back to a key phrase, a key sentence that it's at the heart of this project. We don't yet know what a body can do. That's from Spinoza. And what is the body? Also, it's the question. In the previous seminars, we looked at various ways in which this body is affected from early age through the primary caregiver's enigmatic message. We have seen how this body is affected when we practice something like Zen or contemplative practices together. This body is affected in ways which sometimes we don't even know. We have seen how in dreams, the body, it is the body that dreams, that produces images and also known as affects in visual attire. Then in the fourth seminar, we have a look at love and sex, the way the body gets transported outside of itself, ecstatic body. Also, we have seen the various forms in which this can be liberating or limiting. Then we looked at the psyche's multiplicity, the fact that we are not one, but many. And today, we look at practice, movement practice, a form of theater, a form of avant-garde art, which started in Japan in the 1950s, called Butoh. And I have the pleasure and honor to have with us today Marie-Gabrielle Roti, who is, I would say, the foremost UK Butoh artist and practitioner. And she's been my teacher on and off since the late 90s, and more recently, in the most steady way, for the last 5 years. And at some point, I would like, if she's up for it, I would like her to also come in and say whatever she wants about how her own experience of Butoh as a performer, as an artist, and as a practitioner. And what I want to start with is to link Butoh practice, which some of you have experienced in relation to all the various other bits that we practice and study together as part of this project. But I want to introduce first a few things about active and reactive forces, and also to say this: affect therapy, as we are developing it together, this is a kind of a laboratory experiment, is really an impossible task. I think it's because practices that are similar to it, like psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, not so much at heart, but in the mainstream, they have become, they're too, how can I say, Presbyterian. They're too Northern European, Northern American. They are infused with a kind of Philistine pragmatism and a kind of misunderstanding of the sacred. And they are often geared towards how we can improve ourselves. How can we make what we discover through dreams, what we discover through meditation, we discover through inquiring in our psyche, in our experience, how can we make it useful? Well, one of the definitions of the sacred is that it's utterly useless. It has no immediate gain into the world of the everyday. It is more to do, as we discussed earlier on, with the dimension of soul. Soul understood not as the atomized individual soul, which supposedly will go on living once I am buried or cremated, but rather a domain that is more ambivalent, a domain that is where the liminal dimension is very important, where the demarcation between the living and the dead is not clear-cut, when the demarcation between the human and the non-human is not clear-cut, and so on and so forth. And I think Butoh, as I hope to illustrate, and as I hope to, together with Marie Gabrielle, also practice, because both of us are running a workshop in mid-July, 19th and the 20th of July, called How to Build a Body Without Organs. I hope you can be there. We'll be in London in Finsbury Park, two full days of practice and other connected things. So I want to, first of all, to reiterate some of the things that we have briefly touched upon, but I want to make it more clear. I see today's exploration as inscribed within this understanding of what are active and reactive forces. What is passive? Let's ask Nietzsche in his book, The Will to Power. What is passive, he asks? To be hindered from moving forward, thus an act of resistance and reaction. And what is active? Reaching out for power. Power in Nietzsche is not some stupid desire to dominate others, is not to become a Donald Trump, is not to become a caricature and basically a person thoroughly steamed in reactivity. Power means the power to create, the power to share, the power to be generous, and the power to turn difficult experiences, or Spinoza would call also sad affects, into something proactive, into something that makes us feel more attuned with ourselves and with others. And inspired by Nietzsche, Deleuze made it even more clear, this definition, and made a clear-cut distinction, which will be very useful for our exploration. For Deleuze, in a key book of his, which is often neglected, it's called Nietzsche and Philosophy. An active force has three fundamental characteristics. First, it is plastic. It is dominant in the sense that it's proactive. It's not subjugated to other forces. It has the power to be creative. Two, and this is important, an active force goes to the limit of what it can do. Three, an active force affirms and enjoys its difference. Unlike an active force, a reactive force has diametrically different characteristics. First, it is a utilitarian force of adaptation. Two, it also separates and it denies what the active force can do. And three, it turns the active force against itself. A simplistic way of putting this would be last week, when Danny facilitated me in the voice dialogue, in the multiplicity of the psyche, we went through different parts. Fear was one of them. Let's take a body, fear of anger. An active force means that even a negative emotion, for example, a negative passion, a sad passion, Spinoza will call it, is allowed to be experienced, to do its thing, to move. And when it does that, it turns into something else, or its qualities are refined. So fear can become eventually a courage paired with caution. Anger can become compassion, but not a sort of what we call in Zen idiot compassion. It's not forcing people to cross the road, or denying people of their own independence and the fact that they can perhaps handle their situation. So it's not a kind of a compassion that assumes the inherent weakness of another person, but it's a compassion that is also takes on board their independence. So what would happen is the question if we allow a force, let's say an emotion, to simplify, a passion, an emotion, and a feeling, to do its thing, to be acknowledged. Remember, as we discussed previously, to be acknowledged and accepted, it doesn't mean to vent or to act out. It simply means to feel it and understand it. Instead of having to turn it against itself. Again, Nietzsche famously said, it seems that humans are the only species who turns against itself, who denies and is unable to recognize their own rich life, instinctual life, or the life of the drives, or whatever we want to call it. So why is this important? Because then something like psychotherapy or something like therapy or something like a practice that, be it a movement practice, being an artistic practice, or being a contemplative practice as well, is interested in evaluating. So let's say that in this sense, practice, psychotherapy practice, becomes an axiology. Axiology means a practice of evaluation. The inspiration there is Nietzsche's hammer. People thought, oh, Nietzsche's hammer, what does it mean? Why does he talk about a hammer? Does he want to smash things with his big sort of military mustache? No. The hammer is to sound out whether a bell is still attuned or whether a bell has lost its tune, is no longer useful. So to evaluate, to use axiology, means when we examine any organism, when we examine an entity, when we examine a particular practice, an institution, and so forth, we are looking as to whether there is a balance between active and passive forces, and whether it is possible to tip the balance in favor of active forces. And this is true for most entities, for most groups. Of course, the possibility is there that in something like, Reform UK, say an entity, an organism like that, a collective organism like Reform UK, with this xenophobia, hatred of foreigners, with this narrow-minded view, with a leader such as Nigel Farage. And there are many, many, many examples. Trumpism, the phenomenon of Trumpism. The chance that there are active forces in there is very, very slim. Those are, in fact, you could say interesting if they were not maddening, interesting examples of a full cluster of reactivity, of reactive forces, of a vital force that goes against itself, of a denigration of life. And these phenomena are personal, are political, and so forth. So then the task of the therapist The task of the artist, you could say, the task of the art critic, the literary critic would be, what is the balance? Is this particular organism at the service of reactive forces? And what would it take in our work as psychotherapists, psychoanalysts? What would it take to encourage and facilitate the prevalence of active forces? Active in this context means life affirming. Life affirming means also life death affirming, because the two are closely entwined. This is not a simply pro-life thing. Pro-life, has its sinister connotation, the anti-abortion. So it's more life and death, this stream, mysterious stream of this life-death. Can we be in favor? Can we be complicit? Can we enhance it? And a similar thing we will see in a moment through Ijikata, who is one of the founders, if not the founder of Butoh, of light and darkness, the excessive importance given to light in our culture. We'll go there in a moment. On one level, this also means, and this is also common not only to Deleuze and Guattari and to affect theory, but also to neo-Stoicism. For example, Martha Nussbaum, who would speak about, in a more psychological way, of the inherent intelligence of the emotions. If only we could give honor and pay attention to the intelligence of the emotions, they would have something to tell us. They would enhance our life, and they will make us more, if not anything else, curious and able to live more fully. But because of complex reasons, because of a very dualistic religious heritage, because of also of the influence of positivism in science and in the culture, we don't look at emotions and passions with interest. We look at them as something that we have to overcome. A quote from Hijikata: "Form becomes vivid and disappearing." Another quote from another great Butoh master, Kazuo Ono: "If you wish to dance a flower, you can mime it, and it will be everyone's flower, banal and uninteresting. But if you place the beauty of that flower and the emotions which are evoked by it into your dead body, then the flower you create will be true and unique, and the audience will be moved." A quote from a study by Paul Roquet: "A dancer moving with a dead body is overwhelmed by every emotion. More of life seeps into the dance. Birth, joy, decay, laughter, anger, sadness, impermanence, absurdity, buried memories emerge. Not simply human memories, but that memory way back when you were once a flower struggling to grow from the mud." And from Marie Gabriel's own study in 1996, The Reorientation of Butoh. I'm giving you scattered things, and then we'll go more in depth. Butoh is a Japanese form originally, 1950s, after Hiroshima. I'm not reading, I'm just introducing this passage. 1950s, after Hiroshima, after the war, the devastation. and the sense, the very real sense of dead bodies, of the annihilation of everything. So you could say that on one level it's a Japanese phenomenon. It's certainly born in Japan, developed in Japan. Uh, and yet, as Marie Gabriel writes, it transcends the fact that there is a focus on the body, on the individual body, allows Butoh itself to transcend any cultural specific reading and to create the possibility of a truly international and contemporary dance. This is not to say, Marie Gabriel continues, that we should ignore or abandon the Japanese origins. For according to this article, and she might have different ideas now, but this was in 1996, Butoh, to exist as a vital force outside Japan, to move beyond, the exotic Japan thing, there must be a greater interest, a greater context. And she says, in the West, Butoh has been open to misinterpretation, partly because of its marginalized presence and the rarity of its performances, partly because of the formalization of its original aspirations. The creative development of Butoh by European practitioners, and American for that matter, depends on an awareness of the impulses from which it was born. And speaking of the European influences, the track you heard earlier on is a Scott Walker tribute to Pasolini. Scott Walker of the Walker Brothers, in his late years, the last few years before his death, he produced some amazing sort of avant-garde type of operatic, strange mixture of operatic and metal, industrial metal music. And this is a wonderful tribute to Pasolini. And Pasolini, for those who don't know, I would really encourage you to Google him, to look at his films, to look at his poetry, at his wonderful essays and novels. Heretical Empiricism is a great book of essays. And he was steeped in the European cultural milieu from which partly Butoh drew inspirations. And in particular, I want to focus in a moment on one, briefly on Genet, it's been a great love of mine, but also on Artaud and on the body without organs. And before I proceed, I would like to ask Maria Gabriele if you want to come in and say something, or whatever you feel like saying. It will be really greatly appreciated.
Okay, so greetings everybody, and thank you, Manu, for that lovely introduction. I hope you can hear me, yes? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. So yeah, Butoh, I mean, it's such a big thing to dive into, without there's the historical, there's the philosophical, there's the intentions. I suppose with regards to, what you were talking about with active and reactive and or proactive, active and reactive, I was kind of sort of like musing on the figure of Hijikata himself, who was actually fairly dictatorial in his orientation. And so there's some kind of contradictions there already within Butoh between the desire for what it was trying to do, which was in some senses reactive, but actually going back into the body to really start a kind of process of discovery, reclamation, and so on. But at the same time, Hijikata was actually such a troubling figure. And I was reminded of a book by, I just had to Google the author there. It's by, it's called The Most Remote Thing in the Universe by Kurihaka Kurihara Nanako, and it was published in 1996, originally as her thesis. But she gives a very big expose of how dictatorial Hijikata was, how difficult he was as a person, and how controlling. So there's a kind of irony that, within Butoh, there's a sense of it was looking so much for a sense of liberation, a sense of discovery, a sense of creative freedom. But at the same time, it was so led for so long in its history from 19, he was really like that from 1970 to 1985 when he died. So about 15 years of its last breath through Hijikata, it was very controlled. So in a way, Butoh is always kind of like fighting against that legacy as well. So there's a discovery in your own body, but at the same time, a half awareness of that legacy, which I'm certainly aware of. Anyway, I don't know whether that's helpful for what you're talking about, but yeah, so that's probably what came now from just listening. So yeah.
You, Maria Gabriele. And I hope people could see you because I am fiddling with this various Zoom things. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you very much for that. So um, it was so I when I come across Butoh was okay late 90s. I just went to this class, a weekend class that Maria Gabriele hosted. It was and the teacher was called Burabushi at the time, Japanese, remarkable teacher. And I didn't know of this link uh, between the practice and then this European tradition that I really loved, the avant-garde tradition that I was studying in university, and it was very, very, very important in the, in my studies at the time. And one great exponent to this is Genet, and I think it was Kazuo Ono, wasn't he, whose first performance was on Our Lady of the Flowers, based on Genet's novel, I believe. Uh, Jean Genet is a very important figure, and to some of you who are existential therapists, he might be known through that big doorstopper of a book Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, Saint Genet. Saint Genet. And Genet was kind of appalled. They say it's almost like you buried me alive with this book, with this big book. But there is a part in there, and there is a lot in Genet. There is a lot that is valid. For example, the practice of smuggling. Genet was a thief, a sex worker. He lived many. He was an orphan. He was somebody who lived many years in prison, who taught himself how to write by reading Marcel Proust and writing this wonderful book, his first wonderful book, Lady of the Flowers. And then one of the guards at the prison sequestered the book, destroyed it, and Genet rewrote it again word by word. And the idea of smuggling, the idea of cross-fertilizing practices and ideas across philosophies, across cultures, it comes from Genet. Needless to say, when I try to promote this idea of smuggling into some academic journal, the idea was derided as being not kosher. But that's what we need to do nowadays. We have to smuggle ideas in a milieu, in a world that is increasingly separate. And we only do this our little thing in our little garden. We only do our little psychotherapy. We do our little philosophy. We all do our little yoga there, our little meditation. Anyway, but there is a wonderful quote that Sartre takes from Pompe Funèbre, translated as funeral rites. The title in French is also means funereal blowjobs. And Genet in this book talks about, rather Sartre comments on this book, Pompe Funèbre, where Genet talks about visceral love. Let me see if I can find. I think it's about somebody mourning the death of his lovers. And and there's a description and a kind of ad-libbing, a creative, you could say creative writing on what happens in the darkness in the body. It speaks, and I quote here and there, the movements of algae and waves, organs living a strange life in its deep darkness. These organs themselves, liver, spleen, the green coating of the stomach, the humerus, the blood, the coral canals, the blue intestines. His body was a Venetian flask. I do not doubt that a time would come when this wonderful language, which was drawn from him, would reduce his body as unthreading reduces a ball of thread until it was a speck of light. Genet uses in this particular novel the same detailed description of human entrails as the one used by religious writers. Yet, in his text, a different type of transubstantiation takes place. Transubstantiation is normally, the alchemic symbolic transformation of the bread and wine during the Catholic Mass in the body and blood of Christ. And here we have a transubstantiation through literature and through art, a description of the body entrails, and the affirmation of what Genet calls visceral love. Love is nothing unless it's visceral. So we are in a terrain, I believe, that is close to some of the exploration in Butoh, some of the exploration, particularly the way they manifest in Ijikata, as I understand it. Remember, I'm a practitioner and a student of Butoh, so I might be also talking something that's not entirely right or orthodox, but I guess what I am expressing here is my enthusiasm, my trying to transmit to you the way I was affected by this very profound and mysterious practice, in a sense. So, one idea that is translated, moved from the European avant-garde to the world of Butoh is the body without organs. So what is a body without organs? Could it be, is it ever possible that we can formulate an idea of the body that is free from the reactive forces that we were talking about? There have been great attempts, valid attempts at doing this. The humanistic tradition has spoken of the organism, for example, and that already gives us a terrain which is bigger than simply the self. The problem with the notion of organism is that it presupposes a unitarian view, a sort of a holistic view, which is perhaps removed from the fragmented nature of the body. We also had that attempts through the psychoanalytic tradition of through the unconscious to look at essentially the darkness that is part of the bodily experience, the unknown, the multiple body, and which have been really, all of these enterprises have been hijacked by many epistemological approaches. Could it be that epistemology, the search for knowledge, is essentially based or rooted in fear? I'm not just making this up. At some point, Adorno asked this question: what drives epistemology? What drives our desire for knowledge? Could it be fear? that may or may not be true. I'm not knocking our thirst for knowledge. It can be a good thing. It could be a creative thing. But if there is one practice that moves away from this compulsion to know, and also compulsion to um, everything light and everything understandable and quantifiable, is certainly the practice of Butoh. And I want to jump to Artaud. Artaud, a playwright, a surrealist, a renegade surrealist, an experimenter with substances. He lived with the Tarahumara tribe in Mexico and had experiences with hallucinogenics and reported those experiences. Wrote plays. He also wrote about the theater. And one of his notions is that of the theater of cruelty. And people have written about a connection between the cruelty, so-called cruelty in Artaud, and so-called terror in Ijikata. To me, as I understand this thing, it's an attempt to, even without a direct reference to it, to articulate what Nietzsche had done theoretically in his first youthful book, The Birth of Tragedy, when he spoke of the Greek tragedies, the great Greek tragedies of particularly Sophocles. The other name escapes me. Not Euripides, who was already in the grip of a different culture. As events where there would be a direct experience between where the audience wasn't entirely removed from what would be a representational dance, let's say, but instead something much more visceral that could be felt. And what was felt and was in common was the presence of the god Dionysus. I think Artaud was onto something very, very similar. Artaud's life ended in a psychiatric hospital in Rhodes, and there are some where he was given electroshock treatment, and there are some moving, for me, very, very touching images where the other inmates poured ink on his papers, and he was trying to write until the end, and nevertheless he carried on writing. It's a great example of what Nietzsche calls the great Held. Faced with the most difficult challenges in life, to still resolve to be creative. An example that Nietzsche himself represent. So in Artaud, we find this notion of the body without object. Without organs. Let me see if I can find the quote. Okay, here it is. He wrote a radio play that was never aired. It's like Nico, the Velvet Underground album, songs that never play on the radio. A radio play called "To Have Done with the Judgment of God." The last passage of this short play, was actually a play, reads, "Man," in the language of the time, so the human being is sick because badly constructed. We must make up our minds to strip ourselves bare in order to scrape off that animal cue that itches us mortally. And God, that is. And with God, his organs. For you can tie him up if you wish, but there is nothing more useless than an organ. When you will have made a body without organs, then you will have delivered the human from all their automatic reactions and restore them to their true freedom. Then you will teach them again to dance wrong side out, in the frenzy of dance halls. In this wrong side out will be its real place. The recording of of this radio play that was never aired was one of Ijikata's most precious possessions. Somebody has said that Butoh is Artaud's voice at the end of his life, that in some way continues. Of course, there are other elements that are, to me, they're very moving and very beautiful and very lyrical in a sort of animistic way. I found that from the little I know of the work of Kazuo Ono, this incredible lyricism, incredible heart in that. So, how can we tie this in to the notion of the body? Okay, one way I understand the body without organs, how it could be expressed and manifested through something like Butoh practice, for example, is by divorcing ourselves from understandings of the body that have in some way chained us and constricted us into a particular form. One is the body of biology, the body of medicine. All of us have files in the hospitals about all our history. The GP is a particular body. The psychiatric profession would have a similar thing. There are other manifestations of the body through, the understanding of the organism, through the understanding of a body that can be actualized and so forth. A body without organs is an attempt to free the body from these clutches. And one way in which this could be understood is via Deleuze's distinction between two intertwined areas, which he calls the actual and the virtual. The actual and the virtual are not really simply defined in terms of reality versus possibility, but they are distinct aspects of a single continuous reality. So the actual refers to that which has concrete existence, while the virtual is the potential and intensity that underlies and shapes the actual. Both actual and virtual are real, but the virtual is not a possible, but rather real potential that is fully present and active within the actual. Could it be that this is a question, that through something like Butoh practice, these two forms play against each other? So in a way, you could say that the body without organs appears as a kind of double. There is a stride, what's the word? That it's both actual and virtual, an intensive liminal space that is open to non-corporeal relation beyond the physical organism. This is one of the notions that one thing that comes to mind, and I'm trying to explain something that is very difficult to explain because it's a kind of experience. It took me a long time to understand that in Butoh, it is not, if there is an image, it is not, as in the previous quote, it is not about representation, it's not about mimicking, but it's more to have a particular image. It could be also a presence. It could be, let's say, a particular image from a dream that you had last night, to what would happen if that image, the particular image from the dream, if you were to allow it to percolate inside the body and then move from that space, for example. Or we'll talk about liminal, transient, the self as a transient membrane that is also open to space, is also open to the living and the dead. What would it mean to allow inside my body the presence of a person who is already passed away. This might sound a little spooky, but it isn't really, because the main principle is this. As some of you have practiced the ashes walk, um, the starting point of the practice, as I understand it, is to empty ourselves, to become nothing, to become zero, to be dead. In Zen, it's the same thing. The old masters used to say, die on the cushion. When you sit in meditation, die. It sounds very dramatic. It simply means completely let go. No agenda, no attempt to look pretty, no attempt to represent or show or having to prove anything. Simply be gone. Simply go, go, disappear, and allow something to come in. Allow, and here we are, for the world to affect you. The world might arise from within, it might arise from an external stimulus, let's say. It could be an image, it could be something else. So what a wonderful way, through a, a strange and beautiful and incredibly moving practice, bodily practice, to experience affect in a very, very real way. It took me many, many years to get there. It's because I'm very slow and very stuck in my head. But there was two particular occasions. One was, I don't remember the venue. Marie Gabrielle was teaching a group of actors who were doing a Shakespeare's play. It was Halloween. I forget what the play was. But first of all, I remember her saying to them, don't act. Which I found, I really could have hit something in me. Don't act. Okay, the exercise was to we were lying down, to get out, get up with great effort, as if you wanted to come back to life, or as if you were about to die but wanting to be alive and coming back to life. I remember that exercise very well. And it reminded me of a Zen koan, which I shared with you a while ago. How do you get out of a stone coffin? It's the same idea. And at the time, it was particularly moving because my dear friend and colleague, Richard Pierce, was existential practitioner, a Sartrean scholar, great repute, um, was basically dying, and died a few weeks after that. I pictured him, so it became incredibly powerful and moving. Yeah. So I thought this practice is real. It's real. The other thing was, I think it was. I don't know if it was the same workshop or some other workshop. The practice was to move, to do the ashes walk backward very slowly. And I don't remember if there was an invitation to do that. But there is often an imageries that I found very moving, very powerful in Marie Gabriel's workshop, about this wave of metamorphosis of life and death, or constant movement and season. This particular one was walking, and well, we've done it together with some of you, walking backwards and picturing the past in front of us as we move backward towards the future, and not being able to do anything about the past, even though you might want to redeem certain things, you might want to say sorry to somebody or whatever, or undo and rebuild what has been destroyed and so forth. That was a very, very powerful experience as well. Just to tell you personal, just to tell you how you just start by learning a movement. You think it's just a movement practice, and before you know it, you are uh, really moved by it. One way also to understand this, I find it useful. Some people, particularly a great writer called Maurice Blanchot, I really revere. Talking about Artaud, he says something like this. Here's somebody who wrote in a language which gave you very much the impression that it was spoken by nobody. I think it's something similar happens here in what we call affect therapy. What matters is not me, and my story, and the client's story, which we respect, of course, which we take seriously, which we uh, listen to attentively, and trying to help the person, but more what traverses the body, a language spoken by nobody. So, rightly or wrongly, what really drew me to Butoh practice was a finally a break from this obsession in many spiritual practices included, in many psychological practices, with the personal element, with the narrative, with the story, with biography, with mom and dad, and instead a direct gaze, a direct experience to uh, affect, which is the intensity of life itself that moves through our body, that moves in the room, that moves through every living thing, living, non-living. Um, and this means, uh, as I was saying earlier, an affirmation of life onto death, an affirmation of life and death. And this means an affirmation of darkness. After all, Butoh is the dance of darkness. And here is our talk. Our petrified idea of the theater is connected with our petrified idea of a culture without shadows, where no matter which way it turns, our mind or esprit, spirit, encounters only emptiness, though space is full. But the true theater, because it moves and makes use of living instrument, continues to stir up shadows where life has never ceased to grope its way. Ijikato spoke of luminous darkness, finding beauty not in the thing itself, but in the patterns of shadow, the light and darkness that one thing creates against another. It's interesting how mainstream culture fixation with light, with the desire to shed light, to understand, to view, to destroy via big headlights and telecamera, to destroy the beautiful Lascaux paintings, to have to eviscerate, translate into cognition, understand, weigh up, measure everything that is in the darkness. And in this way, to completely miss the music of the darkness, the music that is in a darkness that it has its own shadows, its own richness, its own nuance, and so forth. And the same applies to the dead, which we try to confine to oblivion. It's interesting that so much literature, I remember an existential colleague of mine once saying, so much literature on grief and grieving, the stages of grief, how to assist everybody, stages of grief, while the dead is completely forgotten. And how different and how refreshing, despite, of course, the controversial, the fact that some of these figures, as Maria Gabriel said, were controversial, like Ijikata, but how refreshing to hear Ijikata says something like this, and I quote, and he's talking about his dead sister. I keep one of my sisters alive in my body. When I am absorbed in creating a Butoh piece, she tears off the darkness in my body and eats more than is necessary of it. And she speaks to me like this. You call it dance and expression, and I'm mad about it. But don't you think that what you can express can only emerge by not being expressed? End of quote. Then she quietly fades away. This is why the dead are my Buddha teachers. I mean, how counterintuitive, how strange and wonderful to think in more wider terms, to not create that clear-cut distinction that we do between animate and inanimate, living and the dead, human and non-human, waking reality and dreams. Why do we create this distinction? Nietzsche would say, to make our life more livable. It's understandable. It's understandable. It could be a good thing, in fact. Um, on the other hand, the problem is that we misunderstand this kind of device that helps us make our life livable. We misunderstand it as the truth. Then we are almost, not almost, most certainly neglecting an entire area of experience, which would have a lot to teach us, as we have discussed in relation to dreams. To create a body without organs, finally, which is a notion that was really brought home by Deleuze and Guattari in particularly in the second book on what was it called? The second book after Anti-Oedipus, the Thousand Plateaus. It's a kind of dismantling. It's a kind of dismantling of the notion of the body and the body subject. So it's something to be approached with caution. We are trying to move away from a notion of a holistic organism. We are trying to move away from an attachment to language that is binding. And so part of the project of the body without organs is also has to do with language and with writing. Wouldn't it be nice if research, psychotherapy research, wouldn't be the absolutely boringly stiff project that it has become? And the same applies to philosophy research. And people will be allowed to roam more freely and to take, for example, inspiration from books like Finnegan's Wake, from Joyce, or practices like Hélène Cixous, or practices of writers like Clarice Lispector, and so forth. So one way of dismantling the body and create a body without organs is certainly through language, through stretching and exploding the language outside what Deleuze and Guattari would call order words, discipline words that keep us in check. It would mean moving beyond the holistic notion of the organism. It would mean re-subverting, if that's the right word, the unconscious, to find again the subversive valence of the unconscious. It would also mean engage in a movement practice, and I can't think of any practice that is better suited to this project than Butoh. That's why I see Butoh as part and parcel of affect therapy. So if we'll ever manage to create a proper training of affect therapy, an integral part will have to be Butoh practice, because I can't think of any practice that really stretches and challenges the view of the body as we understand it. So all of this together would bring us to build a body without organs. Incidentally, if when we do dream work, when we do, for example, dream work as in the matrix, in the social matrix, when we free associate and work with dream material and forget the dreamer and work on the dream itself, that's also a way of creating a body without organs. And I'm sure there are other ways to work with this, which we will have to create together. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. And let's have a break and then a discussion.